So I'm going to spend a little bit of time today throwing some stats at you guys to kind of reinforce what I think is an obvious point to all of us. And as much as I wish I didn't have to share these, I really do think that a lot of organizations still struggle to understand just how big a deal mobile is. I face this in my day-to-day world, and it's just almost soul-crushing to me that I have to even explain to people why these little rectangles of glass really do matter, why we need to develop for that. So I'll give you guys some stats around that. We'll spend some time obviously talking about this big difference. Should I build a native app? Should I build a website? Spoiler alert in case you want to go to another talk during this slot, it depends. Right? There are no clear-cut, easy answers, but we can at least sort of have some discussion around this would push you one way or the other. We'll talk a little bit about sort of mobile mindsets, what those look like, some of the capability these devices have, and of course we'll look at some examples as we go along, and I'll probably skip mobile first depending on time constraints. We'll see where we're at. Now, the growth here, frankly, is pretty stunning, and one of my favorite quotes basically said, show me a mobile-related graph that isn't hockey stick shaped in nature. I don't know if that translates terribly well to the British Isles at least, but we play a lot of hockey where I come from. Not me, because hockey's crazy. I don't like the idea of going out on ice with sticks and hitting people, but other people seem to enjoy it quite a bit. Android activations right now are outpacing baby births, and it isn't even close. Right, now, when this stat first came out, it was actually kind of within the realm of each other, but at this point, it's off the charts how many Android devices are activated in a given day. More iPhones are sold in a given day than babies are born. And again, this number isn't even close. This is an old number. I think this is almost a year old at this point, maybe a little bit more than that. Now, there is a natural cap in here eventually. Everybody is going to have 7, 8, 9, 10 of these things. One of the ways that we sort of look at this space is, how long is it going to take us to get to this magic billion number? And so everybody thought Facebook is a really big deal because it's got 1 billion users, and 1 billion people means a lot to various folks. Well, Android got there in half the time it took Facebook. So if Facebook is worth however much they were worth at the IPO, Android should be worth at least as much, if not considerably more. Right. iOS is on its way to 1 billion units. It'll hit that sometime later, late 2014. I would bank on earlier than later, frankly. I'd be shocked if it didn't happen in 2014, but that's just me. If you look at 2011, Apple had a pretty good year. They sold a lot of iOS devices. In fact, they sold more iOS devices, just iOS devices, than they sold Macs in the previous 28 years combined. And they are like the only PC company that has actually seen growth in their PCs over the last decade. And I can't remember how many quarter after quarter they actually increased where everybody else was decreasing or staying flat. We've got north of 500 million iTunes accounts out there right now, which for us as developers means there's about 500 million people that are primed to give you money easily. They don't have to think about entering credit card numbers and codes and pins and all sorts of stuff. They just say, yep, here's my iTunes password, please, give me your app. We're going to hit this 700 million iOS device literally any day now. It's sometime this month we're going to cross over that threshold, and again, I would bet sooner rather than later. The opening weekend of the iPhone 5S and 5C, they sold 9 million units, which is kind of stunning. We have finally crossed the 1 billion Android activation number, and that ramp looks pretty fascinating. It started relatively slowly and has certainly started to take off. There's no getting around that. And by the way, this number is probably undercounting several million Android devices that exist that don't actually talk to Google Play services. Whether or not that's relevant to us, is kind of a question for interpretation. But one estimate I saw said something like 200 million Android devices in China that have never talked to Google services. And I don't know if like Kindle Fires and whatnot get counted in this or not. I'm not completely certain on that. There are devices now that are showing up that are essentially forks of Android for all practical purposes, and they don't really mention Android, but they are Android devices to a certain extent. Now, to give you a little bit of context for this, there are about 1 billion active Windows PCs in the world right now. Okay, so we've already reached a stage where there are easily more iOS and Android devices than active Windows PCs. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.2 billion internet users. So this implies at least that at least half of those folks can and probably are getting online with some kind of a mobile device. Now, if you think about the growth of this, how are the next billion people going to get online? Is it likely they're going to run out and buy a MacBook Pro or a Dell or an Asus or something like that? Or are they going to have a phone or a tablet. And it seems to me that it's far more likely for the next set of people to come online with some kind of little rectangle of glass. Now, a lot of folks thought, oh, Windows 8 is going to stem this tide, because once Windows 8 comes out, once Microsoft deigns to release a new operating system, everyone runs out and buys new PCs. Yeah, not so much. In 2012, there were more Android devices sold than Windows devices. That's just Android. So as soon as you layer iOS on top of that, we have a much, much larger market than we have in this Windows world. You can make a pretty compelling argument that in 2008, Windows market share was somewhere in the 95% ratio. That made it obviously a pretty big deal for a lot of us. At this point, we're really honestly probably closer to 30% or less now. I'm almost of the opinion that Microsoft, at least in this world that we live in now, is essentially irrelevant. That doesn't mean they're going to stop making money. I mean, obviously, corporations, for various reasons, still use Office and Word and Windows and whatnot. But in terms of where computing is headed, where folks are going, they don't really have a dog in that fight. I think the Nokia purchase is probably too little too late, but time will tell. All right, so this graph is kind of amazing. By the way, this comes from Ben Evans. He's based here. He's one of my absolute favorite analysts in this space. The light blue line that's hard to see on this projector is Windows, and then the little orangish line there, that's iOS and Android. And look at how quickly that eclipsed the Windows market share. And look at where it is today. I mean, that is quite a bit higher up than the PC world. Now, a lot of folks have tried to say, well, it's too late, growth is over, this is now, a commodity market, blah, blah, blah. Well, every week, 500,000 people are getting rid of their feature phones. I mean, I'm actually really surprised at this stage when I run into someone who isn't using some variant of a smartphone. It's almost quaint. Like, isn't that cute? I read an article earlier. I mean, you guys remember how popular BlackBerry was. I mean, everybody seemed to have a BlackBerry, and that meant you were a power broker type person. You were very important, whatever. I've read articles recently that said people who still have BlackBerries, and typically it's because that's what their office demands, when they go to meetings, they try to hide the fact that they have a BlackBerry. They put their iPad on top of it. So, see, no, I'm cool and hip, but I don't look at my phone, please. And several of them actually carry both a BlackBerry and an Android or an iPhone, so that, yeah, okay, this is my real phone, but this is the one I got to carry for work. Although that is changing drastically. My company used to be big in the BlackBerry space, and at this point, we're deprecating BlackBerry left, right, couldn't get rid of it fast enough. It took us about 16 years to get to the first billion. Now that next billion, that's only going to take about 3. And we're already in the process of that. So this doesn't mean that like in 2016 we'll be there. I mean, that probably means like 2015, maybe even late 2014, we're going to hit that number. Last year there were in the neighborhood of 3.2 billion mobile subscribers around the world. That number is only going to increase. That's one of the really interesting things to me, to see how certain countries have just sort of leapfrogged, the buried copper line concept and straight to cell phones. And it really is amazing to me that there are many countries where they don't have reliable electricity, yet everyone has a cell phone. That's amazing. In the last 4 years, about 1 billion people have sort of joined this world. We've still got another 4 billion yet to be served. And we're going to hit this stage, we may already be there, frankly, where there are more mobile devices than humans. And where this really starts to get interesting, a friend of mine and I had this conversation last week, is we're thinking a lot about mobile today, and she says, maybe what we need to start focusing on is this sort of, and I don't love this phrase, but the Internet of Things. What starts happening when more and more stuff gets connected, and your furnace and your refrigerator and whatnot are also connected to the internet, and your car. What does that start to mean for the types of applications that we have to build? I'm not sure. By the way, this will happen sometime this year if it hasn't already. This is a pretty shocking graph. For most people, this little green line would be an incredibly healthy business that you would really, really, really want to be in charge of. Looks great until you look at the iPad and the iPhone, and you see just how staggering they are compared to what is a fairly solid business. The iPhone business alone for Apple, someone just put these stats out, and I'm going off memory, so I may be a little off here. The iPhone business alone is bigger than, I think it's like 470 some of the S&P 500 companies, and it would, I think it eclipses like 27 of the Dow 30 companies. I mean, it's just frightening how big that business is. It's much bigger than Microsoft, which is kind of hard to believe. Something that didn't exist just a few years ago, has eclipsed Office and SQL Server and Xbox and Bing and all that stuff rolled together. It's like, okay, yeah, that's cute, that's quaint. A while ago, Apple and Google combined had somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 billion installs, but that's so last spring. In May, Apple announced their 50 billionth download. They had a big celebration. The person who downloaded the 50 billion thing got, like, I think a $10,000 iTunes gift card or something like that. Not sure what that would buy you, considering everything seems to be freemium today. But Google I/O, shortly after that announcement came out, said that they hit the 48 billion number. So by the end of May, we're easily over 100 billion, which you can start plotting that out. Means we're well past that number at this point. People have a huge appetite for apps. There's no getting around that. This plots Appstore versus Google Play. You can see it took the App Store, or took the Google Play Store a little while to kind of catch up, but man, once that ramp hit, it's pretty amazing. And I speculate that this has to do with a couple of factors. One, big improvements in Android itself. Lots of improvements were made from the sort of the 2 fork up to the 4s. It's gotten a lot better, I would argue. But I also think this shows a shift in people that are finally figuring out their Android device as a computer. That doesn't apply to you. You guys have known that since the first one you bought. Your parents, maybe not so much. Now, I was at my chiropractor's office a few months ago, and one of the PAs was looking at new phones, and she was asking me my opinion, and so she's showing me these phones she's going to buy, and every single one of them was running Android 2.2 or 2.3, and I pointed that out to her. I said, now, are you sure you want to do that? Because this is an old version of the operating system. She said, well, that's okay. I only want to use my phone to make calls and text my daughter. Now, at some point, she's going to realize she's got a computer in her pocket. And what is that going to mean? And what is that going to mean for the types of experiences that we have to build when she and the folks that she represents who just want to use their phone to make phone calls? That's kind of crazy. I didn't always know that app was there, but it is. And they're going to realize that their phone can do so much more. Now, in terms of apps, you probably exceed many of these numbers. The average iOS device has got 83 apps. The average Android device has 53 apps, plus or minus. My wife was cleaning up her phone one day and was really starting to chastise me for what are all these apps, what do they do, why did you buy them, why do you have them here? And to be brutally honest, I didn't have answers for many of those questions because I lose track. Somebody mentions something, you download it, you play with it, and then you forget about it. So it's kind of entertainment for some folks these days. Apple's paid out something north of $10 billion at this point. That number just keeps creeping up. I don't know how to feel about the App Store economic model. I really don't. I'm of two minds. There's a part of me that says, gee, I'd really like there to be an environment where people can sell a product for a decent price. 99 cents free, that's not decent. And I don't like some of the gamification sort of things that a lot of apps are doing to entice people to give them more money than they would have just paid for the app outright. Now, the counter argument says that because so many things are free or cheap today, people will try much more than they would in the past. That if everything was 10 bucks, 15 bucks, something like that, people would be like, nope, I'm not gonna potentially throw away a large sum of money on something that I might not like. I'd rather get it for free, try it. If I like it, then I'll go ahead and throw a little bit of money at it. So not sure how to feel about that, but the reality is that does seem to be the market we're in. So our choice is to adapt to that or try to fight it, and I don't think the fight's going to win. The music industry tried to fight the whole downloadable music thing too, and that didn't work out so well for them. This chart shows you music versus apps, and at least in the US, iTunes is the dominant music retailer. And so it took them considerable amounts of time to hit kind of these 10, 20 billion download kind of numbers. Not so much with apps. The app curve just keeps getting steeper and steeper. I find that very interesting. When you plot that also with books thrown into the mix, books are that little itty bitty yellow line over there. Some of this I think is just cost. Books cost more, music costs less, apps cost even less. And I think the last average selling price number I saw for apps was like 23 cents or something like that, which is not a lot of money. Whereas music has still stayed pretty consistent in that right around a dollar mark, plus or minus. But what this shows us is there's roughly a 2-to-1 ratio here between apps and music. People have a tremendous appetite for apps. Again, for a lot of folks, this is entertainment. I was on a flight, I think it was last summer, and the woman I was sitting next to, she and I spent the entire flight just comparing what was on our iPads. You know, what games do you have? What apps do you have? What do you find useful? And I mean, that was a really interesting experience. I bought a car a couple of years ago, and the guy who was doing our financing, he had his iPad there. My son was starting to get a little restless, and so he hands him the iPad, and there's all these games on it. And of course, what does my son want? Every single one of those games then has to go on our iPad at home. So, of course, Deju, another guy that I deeply respect in this space, he threw this quote out last year and said, you know, 1 in 4 of us around the world are going to use these little software capsules. And this is what he means by a software capsule. And when he said that, he was talking about this year. Right? So there's a pretty decent chance he's right about this, because he usually is. 2009, since 2009, mobile web usage in the US has doubled. And that number, I think, will double again here even more rapidly than that. Right. Facebook, half of their user base is mobile right now. That's somewhere north of almost 500 million people, plus or minus. Most people seem to have the Facebook app installed, on iOS in particular. A little less so on Android. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. I know there was that big push with Facebook Home that didn't seem to quite take off maybe the way they had hoped it would. Amazon's doing about $1 billion in sales on mobile devices right now. That's not an insubstantial number for them, considering their margins are pretty razor thin, and they have thrown an awful lot of engineering behind this problem from their point of view. We've been selling more smartphones than computers for quite some time now. At a certain level, this makes a lot of sense, because people are more naturally going to turn over their cell phone on a regular basis. Most people are going to hang on to their laptop for a period of time, other than us. And we'll turn those over pretty regularly too, just because, hey, something's faster, something's bigger. Although, you notice that pace has really changed. I mean, you guys all remember, I don't know how many years ago, where it's like if somebody had bought a computer 6 months after you did, it was literally like twice as good a computer as you had, and it cost half as much. That is really sort of flatlined. And if we're really honest and we look at sort of the gigahertz and all that kind of fun stuff, laptops today are not substantially faster or better than ones you would have bought even 2 or 3 years ago. Mostly what entices me to finally upgrade a machine is I run out of hard drive space. It's at that stage where I've once again somehow, well, I'll never fill this up. This is what happens when you have a child and you have digital cameras. Now, this is an interesting question. At what point do most of us carry smartphones? And this is another one of those cases where we were out ahead of this, because most of us started carrying smartphones as soon as it became practical to do so, and some of us even before that. Now, depending on where you're at, depending on whose numbers you believe, Nielsen, at least in the US, has claimed we're already over that. In fact, the last number I saw put it at north of 60% of at least folks in the US are carrying a smartphone. And that number tends to hold pretty consistently across at least the developed world. Now, saturation is another interesting way of looking at this. And saturation just says, at what point do you just expect that when you go to somebody's house, they're going to have that thing? And right now, like the reigning king of this would be the DVD player. The DVD player got to saturation faster than anything else. The smartphone is absolutely going to blow that out of the water. And we're going to hit that phase really quickly, where if you run into someone and they don't have an iOS or an Android device, maybe a Windows Phone device, it's going to be like, wow, what crazy world are you living in? These tablet things, these iPads and whatnot, they seem to be pretty popular. And there's some argument about whether it's a PC or a post-PC device. I don't know that that's terribly interesting, simply because people are obviously buying them and using them, so there must be something there. But the best theory I've seen is, as of now, we've reached the point where the tablet market is bigger than the PC market. That's kind of scary. In 2012, Apple sold more iPads, just iPads, than HP sold PCs. There's a very compelling argument that says if you add iPad sales into PC sales, Apple is the largest PC retailer in the world right now, and it isn't even close. Who knows the answer to this question? Is it a Canon? Is it a Nikon? Do we have any photo geeks in the room? It's always a good question to lob at a photo person. It's like, oh, I hear whatever brand they don't own is better than the brand that you own, and watch sparks fly. Very, very enjoyable. The iPhone. And it's funny to me that like the top 3 are all just variants on the iPhone, and it won't take long for the iPhone 5S to work its way into this number. right? So this actually, I took this snapshot before the iPhone 5S or 5C was announced. My suspicion is you're going to see some changes there pretty quickly. The iPhone 4 will probably drop off, and I don't know if it'll be able to eclipse the Canon, but we'll see. We'll see. The average person looks at their phone a lot. I know I do this. I know my son, who is 6, he gets the old iPhones in our house, and I'll end up in his bucket as iPod touches. And anytime now we basically get in the car, Dad, can I bring my phone? In fact, the other day, this scared me. The other day he said, Dad, does my iPhone have Wi-Fi on it? I said, yeah, it does, buddy. Great, when can I get a data plan? I'm like, not anytime soon. Aw, why not? Because I don't need you to have data. It's scary to me that a 6-year-old wants data. It turns out we look at our phone about 10 times an hour. For some of us, that might be low. For some of us, that might be a little higher than that. Certainly if you have teenagers in your house, it's certainly considerably higher than that. But think about all the things the phone has replaced for you. Just kind of looking around the room, I don't see a whole lot of watches. Watches used to be something we all had to carry. We all had to have on us. And now, for many of us, our phone is a better watch than a watch, because the phone always adjusts to the right time zone. The phone is always set accurately because it has to be. Not so much for the thing that you put on your wrist or put in your pocket. I am absolutely convinced that for my son, a watch will be nothing but jewelry. And the idea of it telling time will be this sort of quaint historical thing. Well, I'm not sure why it tells time. I don't know what that's all about. But I bought it because it coordinates with my outfit or something. Now, I've given you a lot of US-centric data. I apologize for that. It's hard sometimes to find more global data. Online traffic, though, in China is spiking in a big way, and this is having some really interesting ramifications for the carriers there. They make a substantial amount of money, as much as other carriers do, on things like text messages and stuff like that. And as people start using more data, those streams of revenue start to collapse. And so you got to find new ways to get revenue. In many ways, the carriers absolutely adore the fact that we're doing more and more stuff on these pipes because they can charge us a metric crap ton to do so. Now here in the UK, almost a quarter of online sales are from a mobile device right now. Almost a quarter. I think we all know where that number's going. It isn't going to retreat. It will get bigger. And I would wager that most of us in this room have probably bought something on our phone at some point. Or will in the near future. 20% of global internet traffic right now is from a mobile device. Ponder that for a second. 20%. And again, that number is growing, not shrinking. I suspect another 50% of it is like Netflix and streaming video, and then God knows what the other 30% is. You can insert your own joke here. Now, the moral of the story is this is the kind of stuff that should be getting people's attention. This is the kind of stuff that I throw around in my office to get people to understand why this is a big deal and why we need to be thinking about this and thinking about it now. A lot of companies seem to have this attitude that, if I just bury my head in the sand long enough, a vendor will come along and solve all my problems for me. And I can just give them a big check and walk away and life is good. Now, if I haven't given you enough stats, Luke Roboleski puts out stuff pretty much every Monday. I strongly advise you to take a look at what he's doing. Follow Ben Evans, follow Horace Dedew. There's so many good things in this space right now. People putting out lots of really good information to help you understand why this matters and to help you persuade folks in your organization that it does. Now, the PC, this thing a lot of us have built our careers around, it isn't really that personal, especially when we compare it to our phone. Because think about your phone. It goes with you everywhere you go. Have you ever you walk out of your house and you realize you don't have your phone, you have that brief moment of panic, you turn around and go back and get it? There was one time, I think this was either last week or the week before, I had to run pick up my son at school and I didn't have my phone with me. And I almost turned around and I'm like, crap, I'm not going to get there in time. I just need to go. And it was, I'll be honest, I was a little, what am I going to do without my phone? And school's like a 10-minute drive away. It's not like I need to go, to the end of the state or something like that. It's not that far. But I was a little concerned about what happens if I don't have my phone with me. But think about what I'd know if I had your phone. Would anybody leave their phone up here unlocked during the next break? Is that something you'd willingly do? Don't worry, the NSA and their global partners can already get into your phone if they want to. That's clearly been proven out, but they probably already have been. But I have your schedule. I have your email. I can see who you've been texting. I can see what pictures you've been sending people. I can figure out where you've been. take a look at recent searches. A lot of really interesting privacy concerns there. And in fact, most of us, I don't think, would willingly carry around a little locating chip that goes with us everywhere we go, and yet we all carry a phone with us everywhere we go that knows where we are and where we've been and where we've made calls and where we've done searches from. But these things have become such a constant part of our lives. I was in a stand-up meeting a couple years ago, and I was checking something on my phone, and one of my coworkers looked at me and said, "That phone is like an appendage for you, isn't it?" And I said, yeah, I guess it kind of is. And I didn't realize how reliant I had become on my iPhone until I took an international trip and I landed and I get that wonderful text message from my carrier that says, "By the way, if you even attempt to use your phone the way you'd like to, we are going to charge you a ton." So a friend of mine and I were in Poland last year, and he lost his phone. He fell out of his pocket while we were in the taxi, and we tried desperately to find it. And so we were literally driving around Krakow in another taxi using the Find My Phone feature on iOS to try to track this thing down. And at one point, he looked at me and said, "Hey, do you have international roaming on your phone?" I said, No, I don't. "Can I borrow it for a minute?" "Sure, why not?" He says, "I promise I'll pay you back." Anybody want to wager how much of a bill he racked up on my account trying to find his phone? It was $300 US. All right, and I mean, so he basically bought himself a new phone in an effort to find his existing phone. It was very, very crazy. And unfortunately, we never did recover his phone. We think either the person discovered they had the phone and said, "Sweet, I can make a quick buck on this," and turned it off so we couldn't find it, or he like drove into a parking garage that was under a building and we couldn't get signal anymore. But these things have become a constant companion. A lot of people use it at home while they're watching TV. They use it when they're bored, waiting in line somewhere. They use it at work if they're bored, or if they want to get around blocking software or something like that. But think about your usage pattern here. This is not a sometime thing anymore. This has become an almost constant thing for us, which means we have to deal with this. Now, a lot of vendors are going to come to you and say, "I will sell you a magic shrink ray. We will aim this at your application, shrink it down, and poof, it'll all work. A little bit of CSS, fairy dust, and life is good." And by the way, when a vendor tries to sell you that, that should be the look on your face. Utter disbelief. This just isn't possible. It'd be great if it was. It really would be nice. But that isn't going to cut it. The single most important thing here, and I'm very much of the opinion, this is more important than whether we build a native app or a web app or a hybrid app. You must rethink the experience. If we don't bother to take a step back and go, all right, what do people want to do in a mobile context? We fail, regardless of how we choose to surface it up. That is the key. Now, XKCD has an interesting way of looking at this. They say, all right, this is what a typical university website has on it. These are the typical reasons why people come to the university's website, and the only overlap basically is the name of the school. If this is what happens with your mobile app, regardless, again, of how you surface it up, here's what your app offers, here's why people are coming to your app. If that intersection is this poor, you have failed, you will lose, your customers will go somewhere else. Your app will get deleted or shuffled off to a page somewhere deep in somebody's springboard. Now, one of the things that's really fascinating to me about these devices is they can do a whole lot of stuff that PCs can't. You know, they're going to change based on orientation. That's a pretty common thing. They have all sorts of gyroscopes, accelerometers, and different sort of sensors and whatnot in them. You know, I've seen apps where you can take your phone, put it under your pillow, and it will measure your sleep patterns and, you know, how restful were you, how much did you move around. I'm not so sure I really want to stick my phone under my pillow, but that's just me. They all have location. Where are you? That turns out to be really, really freaking useful. And by the way, your PC knows where you are too. The browsers today have that feature baked in, but most PCs still don't have a GPS chip in them. Your phone does. They're all touch-based. They've got all these multi-touch gestures. In fact, it's pretty clear that's becoming the dominant paradigm right now in interface design, for better or worse. When you look at Apple during their holiday quarter, this is usually one of their busiest quarters. They sold almost 50 million phones and 23 million iPads. Android activations are through the frickin' roof. Windows phones and the Surfaces, they finally figured out that touch kind of mattered, although they're sort of biffing that a little bit with Surface in particular. Nokia and BlackBerry sure tried, you know, although frankly it's probably the end for them. Interestingly enough, it took a while for that to sink in, by the way. This was when the iPhone was announced. BlackBerry actually saw growth for quite a while until they didn't anymore. And now they're basically being sold off for spare parts. But look at what our kids are interacting with on a daily basis. I just saw a tweet earlier today that was very reminiscent of a quote that I've thrown around before. And you know, the basic gist of it is like anything that gets created before you're born, that's just part of the air. That's just in existence. Anything that gets created up until you're maybe 30 or 40, and for us, I'd like to say that number's higher. You can adapt to it and you figure it out and it's cool. And then you hit an age where anything that gets created after that is against the laws of God and nature, right? And I've wondered about this because, as my son gets older and just sort of interacts with things, I have honestly asked myself, when am I going to get to the point where I'm going to buy some doodad or gadget and just say, I can't figure this out. Here, Everett, help me, help Dad do this. Because it will happen, and I don't know how I'm going to feel about that day. Now, it isn't just mobile. My home airport, MSP, has these kiosks all over the place, and at first blush, they look like just any kiosk you'd see in any mall or, in London on dang near every street corner telling you what's nearby. But then you get closer and it says, no, touch me. Touch here and start typing. And in case it's not obvious enough, they've got a little rotating advertisement screen above it, and every fourth or so ad is, hey, don't just look, touch. Down in one of our concourses, we have this ginormous touch game, this touch memory game. It's wall size. You can buy tap, tap, tap. At Hartsfield, one of the airports I fly through fairly regularly, they have American football game. I was explaining to my son that in the rest of the world, soccer is called football, and he was kind of confused by that. And then I pointed out to him, I said, buddy, you realize that in American football, you use your hands, and you kick the ball occasionally, whereas in soccer, you kick the ball all the time. And he's like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense, does it, Dad? I said, no, it really doesn't, but I wasn't around to name it, so don't blame me. Right? But again, this is all touch-based. Touch, and throws the ball. I was at this conference center in Sweden, and there was this panel hanging on the wall, and right above it, touch me. And my first thought was, I bet that sign wasn't there when they first hung that on the wall. And my bet is the next time I go to that conference center, the sign is gone, because it'll just be assumed that you can touch any piece of glass that's hanging on the wall. More and more hotels now have a kiosk type thing, and they vary in shape and whatnot, but the basic concept is the same. Touch the screen to ask about airport information or food or whatever it happens to be. Sometimes they hang on the wall, sometimes they're an iPad that's on a stand. It really does vary. Sometimes they're this very common sort of TV size thing. Right? But again, same deal. Touch me to get more information. This is almost becoming odd to go to a hotel, at least for me, that doesn't have something like this. And they all want you to touch it. And they all tell you in some way, shape, or form that I'm touch enabled. Go ahead, interact with me, and I will tell you stuff. I ate at this restaurant near one of our venues last year, and on every table was this little kiosk. You didn't even need to interact with the waiter if you didn't want to. You could order your food and your drinks from here, and if the people you were sitting with were boring, you could play games the whole time. I was at our show in Florida last year, and there's a really nice steak restaurant attached to it, and I said, hey, can I see your wine list? They handed me an iPad. And I thought this was brilliant on two reasons. First of all, it's backlit, so I can actually read it in a darkened steak restaurant. And more importantly, I could search. I could search for a wine that I wanted. That to me is really, really, really useful. At that same event, outside all our rooms, much as we have little pieces of paper telling you what talk is in a given room, they had these little TV screens. And at first I thought it was just an electronic version of that. But then I realized I could actually touch these things along the bottom. And you can see just under my finger there's a little mouse pointer. So it is converting my touch into a click. More and more places I go, at home at least, I'm running into this. Now, I don't for the life of me know what a belly card is, but they still have iPads hanging on the wall or near the cash register saying, come on, go ahead and tap to belly. Again, I don't really know what that means, but they seem to be almost everywhere I go these days. Again, my home airport down the G Concourse, that's actually where a lot of our international flights go out of. That's where I flew out of on Sunday. Every seemingly half meter, we've got an iPad, excuse me. And this is how you order, This is how you pass the time before your flight. And it isn't just at sort of the proverbial single seat bar seat, it's also at every table. So not only do you order from here, again, if your traveling companions are total bores, no problem, you can entertain yourself while waiting for your meal or waiting for your flight. I was out at the Air and Space Museum in Virginia last year with my family, and I didn't notice this right away until I saw my son playing with it, but they have these kiosks, little sort of pedestals around some of the displays, and I looked over and Everett was playing with this thing like he didn't even bat an eyelash. I bought him a game on the iPad earlier this year, and I said, buddy, do you want me to show you how to use it? And he just kind of looked at me the way 6-year-olds will look at their dads and said, no, Dad, I got it. And I thought, yeah, that's right, you do, don't you? You don't really need my help figuring this stuff out. I would argue we're at the point where it's just assumed that a piece of glass hanging on the wall is touch-enabled. These things all have audio, for better or worse. We can talk to them. They can talk to us. We can take pictures. We can use that as an augmented reality type feature. They can connect to the world around us in various ways, shapes, or forms. They have proximity sensors. When am I near your face? When am I near something else? Email, contacts, apps, etc. There's a lot of stuff we can leverage. Now, I do want to point out, guys, that simply being able to do something doesn't mean it's a good idea to do it. All right, so Path got in a bunch of trouble last year because they were shipping your address book off to their servers. When you said, sure, I'd really like to find my friends. So there's some really unexpected things that can happen when you give permissions to certain apps. Now, I think one of the coolest features, frankly, is this augmented reality. It looks a little geeky, don't get me wrong. But this is actually from not too far from here. This will tell me where the nearest tube station is. And it'll tell me what lines run there. And it can tell me, by the way, if you go this way, maybe you get better service if you go to Aldgate instead of Tower Hill. You can also use these things to help you explain the sky. Say, I don't know what star that is. Well, there's an app for that. I mean, think about when you were a kid. If you would have asked your dad, hey, Dad, what star is that? Your dad would have made up an answer. Would have just come up with something. My personal favorite is like Nebulon 7 or something like that. We can't do that anymore. We actually will take out our phones and go, oh, yeah, that's Vega. What's Vega? Well, I don't know. Let me tap on that and see if it gives me more information. Right. Now, I can get at that information on my laptop. I can look up the tube schedule on my laptop. But that's nowhere near as convenient as just being able to pull my phone out of my pocket and doing this and having it orient me. Although, again, you do look a little weird. That is one place where the glass integration is kind of nice. Although having interacted with some folks wearing Google Glass, that glass hole expression is pretty apt, frankly. Now, one of the things we need to understand, guys, is a lot of these capabilities aren't exposed natively in the browser. The browser doesn't get access to them. There are ways we can get access to them by writing a hybrid app, or there are some theoretical HTML5 device APIs that we can tie into, but that's still got a ways to go, frankly. All right, so that is one of the dividing lines. So if you find yourself in a situation where, man, we really need to take advantage of the camera or something like that, if that isn't natively exposed in the browser, and typically that stuff isn't, you're going to, at a minimum, have to go to a hybrid app. And you may end up having to go full native to take advantage of that stuff. Now, at this point, we don't have a choice here. Anybody who says we can wait on mobile, that's akin to saying we don't really need to be in business. We don't really need to serve our customers. We can dictate to our customers they're going to come to us, in the way that we tell them to. So what do we do about that? Now, one option, of course, is to build a native app. And, for a lot of us sort of geeky guys, that makes a lot of sense because we get to dig into Objective-C or Dalvik or something like that, and it's something fun and new to learn. I'd caution you a little bit on that, though. The first question I'd ask you is, do you need a native app? Do you actually require those deep native APIs to give the kind of experience that your customer demands? And by the way, typically one of the questions you look at here is the application that we're selling, or I should say, is the application itself, is that the product? Is that how we're going to make our money? Or is the application itself a secondary aspect of some other product? So I had an attendee once who their company made, I'm blanking on the word, but a music thing in like a bar, restaurant kind of thing, a jukebox. And they had hybrid apps for all the major platforms that would allow you to interact with it. And so you could actually buy the music that way as opposed to having to get money out of your pocket and plunk it into the machine. So for them, what they actually sell to the proverbial restaurant bar is the music playing device. The apps are secondary to that. So for them, the native isn't a requirement by any stretch of the imagination. There's a pretty decent chance you can get by just fine with an HTML5 app. Pretty decent chance. HTML5 has a lot of capabilities in it. And right now in the world, there's something north of 3 billion HTML-capable phones. Now, I want to caution you, while that's a big number, not all of those 3 billion have a particularly good browser in them. All right, and a lot of them are WebKit today. That is the dominant 800-pound gorilla in that space. However, there's still an awful lot of really old, really crappy browsers in existence. So I'm gonna poke at Delta a little bit here. That's my primary carrier. I live in a hub city, so I don't really have a choice. If I get on an airplane, it's going to be a Delta plane, almost without exception. And they've improved this a bit, but I like showing this for historical purposes. They have a mobile web experience. You go to it, you can actually log in. Once you're logged in, you can actually get to flight information. Now ponder for a second some of the questions you might ask about a trip you're taking on an airplane or on a train or something like that. One of the key questions I'm always asking myself is, what time does my flight leave? Because usually I got to do some math backwards to figure out when do I need to leave my house, leave my hotel, leave my office, whatever it is, so that I'm at the airport in plenty of time to make my flight. So, looking at screen number 3 over there, what time did my flight leave for Madison, Wisconsin? I assure you it's there. Is it easy to spot? It's kind of buried, isn't it? And think about the situation you'd be in. Maybe you're quickly running towards the airport, or you're trying to call a cab, and you're probably feeling a little stressed out, maybe a little rushed. It's hard to spot that data. Now notice what jumps out at you. Is there any number on there that's really easy to see? Surrounded in red. That's a confirmation number. Now, guys, I fly a lot. I have no clue what the confirmation number does. I believe one time in the last 5 years, I've had a gate agent or a flight person ask me, what's your confirmation number, please? Yet that's the thing they chose to highlight. Now, I'm picking on them a little bit here because, I mean, let's be honest, that's functional. It works. The nicest thing I can say as a Minnesotan about this is it's okay. But they've gone a step further, and they've actually built native apps. And this is a little old. They have revamped it, but it's got the same basic information. So I can do the same stuff, flight status, schedule, check-in, etc. There's the same information panel you just saw before. What time's that flight leave? A little easier to spot now, isn't it? Now, the confirmation number's still there. It's been, I would argue, correctly de-emphasized. And if I'm honest, to take a step back, this is really more of a UI design issue than it is a native versus web kind of a concept. But my point is, if you don't rethink the experience, you're going to fail. So Delta, in that previous example, they just sort of web-enabled their normal website. And from a checkbox perspective, that was okay. But from an actual user engaging with it standpoint, suboptimal would be the nicest thing I can say about it. This is much, much better. Right, so given the choice, as a customer of Delta or any airline, which one of those are you going to reach for? I think it's fairly obvious you're going to go for the right. Now, I'll be honest, we could certainly make this look more like that. A little bit of CSS, a little bit of HTML5, we can actually get these to be pretty darn close. But the interesting question here is, what are people naturally going to gravitate towards? Now, certainly could make that mobile site better. That would be one of my recommendations because, one of the big things that we talk about in my organization now is we don't get to dictate anymore. The era of popping up an error message when someone comes to your website and saying, this site optimized for, that's over. We don't get to do that with mobile devices. You have no chance if you attempt to say, oh, this site's optimized for insert operating system here. That is a great way to lose customers. And of course, the beauty of that customer is they're going to tweet that. They're going to post that to Facebook. They're going to tell everyone in their social circle about that, unfortunately. Now, the native app avenue is not an easy choice. This is not the obvious angle. Now, I did try to kind of set you up there by showing you, frankly, a bad web app versus a pretty darn good native app. There's some things you need to ask yourself when you go down this path. What operating systems do we need or want to target? Now, for us, when we're talking about our external stuff, we look at our logs. And periodically, every 4 to 6 months, we go back and look through the logs again and adjust our set of these are the N number of devices that we need to target. And for us, that's a fairly broad spectrum. I think off the top of my head, it's like iPhone 5, iPhone 4S. We obviously still care about iOS 7, iOS 6, iPad, Kindle Fire, Samsung's Galaxy 3. I don't know when the 4 will creep in there, but probably fairly quickly. So we have a set of devices. I think the number's right around 10 right now. That if you're making an external site today, it needs to work at a minimum on those devices. It should work on more potentially, but that's what we have to target. And different apps, depending on their needs, may augment that, but that's sort of the starting point. Now, if we're talking internal, we just rolled out a big product to a bunch of folks where we gave them iPhones. We sent 1,500 iPhones out into the field. That actually makes life a little bit easier because now we don't have to worry about, well, is it compatible with, Android 4.3 and 4.2 and 4.1? Doesn't matter. We're targeting a specific thing. So if it's an internal customer kind of facing product, now we get to maybe dictate a little bit in terms of operating system. Although this whole bring your own device concept is eroding that ability. And more folks, they want whatever they have at home, they want to be able to bring that to the office and use that. Boy, the version thing is brutal. iOS 7 upgrades, there were 200 million in the first weekend alone. We don't see anything even remotely like that in Android. Not even close. Now this is kind of old, but the basic concept applies. When you look at iPhones in particular, Apple does a really good job of rolling updates back to older devices. Even iOS 7 will run back to, I think it's 4S's. Now it doesn't necessarily get all the features, but it gets most of them. When you get into the Android space though, the backwards compatibility thing falls off a cliff. And in many cases, a device, even if it's only 6 months old, is not running the latest version of Android and may never run the latest version of Android. To me, this is the biggest failing Google has in the Android space. They could have made it essentially mandatory that new updates get pushed out so long as the device can physically handle it. The problem here, guys, is the carriers and the handset manufacturers have absolutely no incentive for you to get a better phone until you go buy a new one. So they are going to sit on those updates as long as possible. And it is amazing to me how many times that is a year or longer. So right now, according to Google's own numbers, we're still less than 50% of devices are on the latest version of Android. And that's only going to get worse when Key Lime Pie comes out. Or I'm sorry, KitKat. We renamed it to have a nice corporate tie-in where allegedly no money exchanged hands. So this number will drop precipitously once KitKat comes out. All right, unfortunate. What's really scary to me, guys, is how much of the devices are still running gingerbread, let alone ice cream sandwich. So that's back in time. And as developers, wow, that's brutal. Now, what typically happens, and I don't think this is a coincidence, is at least in the US where contracts are the dominant approach here, the upgrade comes out right as your contract expires, so you might as well buy a new device anyway. Now, some of the ad networks look at this as well, and when Jelly Bean came out, it took it 2 months to get to 1.5%. When iOS 6 came out, they got to 15% in a day. One day, 15% of Apple devices were upgraded to iOS 6. After 48 hours, you're seeing almost 35% adoption, plus or minus. A week after iOS 6 was out, 60% of iPhones had that, and almost 41% of iPads. Now, to get to the 17% adoption rate, took iOS 6 about a day. It took Ice Cream Sandwich nearly a year. That is stunning. Now, iOS 7 is frankly exacerbating this. It took a day to get to 18% of devices. A day. 3 days after release, it had already surpassed the number of iOS 6 devices that were out in the wild. Now, at least some of that is because in recent updates, they've actually maybe turned on a switch that say, if I'm connected to Wi-Fi, go ahead and download the latest version. So once you take customers out of the picture, it happens even more rapidly. Now, this is amazing to me. During this period, when iOS 7 rolled out, there were 2.2 terabytes worth of iOS 7 downloads every second. Think about that for a second. I mean, that's kind of amazing. And that first weekend, guys, 200 million devices were updated. 200 million. So by now, you're looking at a pretty substantial number of devices that are on iOS 7. So if you're in iOS land, it makes it much, much easier to target the latest APIs. People get there much, much faster than they do in the Android ecosystem. All right, this uptake, frankly, is pretty remarkable, especially when compared to where Android sits. Here's another Ben Evans stat on iOS versus Android. So current iOS basically blows Android out of the water. Last year, finally, we can see where Android pops up in. So that's basically what you're guessing in the Android ecosystem, is that you're about a year behind what the major version is. So when Google announces the next version, you pretty much have to bank on a year from now we can take advantage of those APIs. All right. Don't let anyone tell you fragmentation isn't an issue. It is. It is painful. You will very quickly pine for the era of Netscape versus IE. It was so much simpler when all we had to deal with was a couple of browsers. At this point, we're talking about so many different operating systems, so many different patch levels. This is a slightly older number, but the general trends still hold today. It takes a very long time for new versions of Android in particular to roll out. So that's a question we have to have internally. We have to ask ourselves very honestly, can we handle multiple operating systems? Are we able to draw a line in the sand at any point to say we don't support anything that's lower than this? That's hard to do, because the last thing we want in most organizations is someone to roll up in an older vehicle and say, I'm sorry, we're not going to take your money because you chose to drive to the store in an old car. That's not appropriate. But we have to balance that against the amount of developer resources that's going to go in to build that. In some cases, we need to think long and hard about handsets. And I'll be honest with you, there are issues between different devices. A question?
Yeah, I was just thinking, do you think it's kind of a hangover from the web world where there was never really going to be any browser dominant? So the way we made websites, we just made more browsers all the time, say the top 5 or whatever. Is it a bit of a hangover now that we're trying to, or that we're starting from a base where we need to support dozens of handsets and versions?
Are we paying for the sins of the past, so to speak?
Yeah, is it a hangover from that?
Yeah.
Instead of saying actually, is it positive revenue? Are we?
Sure.
Do we just cover 75%, and is that enough for the business model?
That's a great question. I mean, so basically, can we sort of shoot for the 80-20 rule? Where it'll work on maybe 80% or some number of devices, and hopefully that gives us enough revenue. It really depends on what we're trying to do and who we're targeting. There may be cases where that's very legitimate and it's good enough. And what you see in a lot of cases is we'll give you the basic functionality, essentially regardless of device, but the more specialized stuff requires higher operating system handset level. So perhaps we'll allow you to file a claim, but we won't let you take a picture if you don't have 4.3 or iOS 7 or something. I don't know. Just pick something random like that where certain features are only enabled when you come at those devices. Now, hopefully we don't have to be real upfront about telling someone that oh, you'd have a much better experience if you had a better phone. But we can at least let them do the basics. Maybe they don't get to do all the nifty whiz-bang stuff. So this is a really scary site if you're the QA folks. This is one company's, this is a partial test bed they have. This is literally only the devices that would fit on the table. Now, the problem here, guys, if we just let's just casually assume there's only 40 devices here, which isn't true. And let's just casually assume that it'll only take us an hour to test our app on every one of those devices. That's a person week of testing right there. So you have to factor that into your development lifecycle to say, okay, if we do a full regression test, how long does that take? Can we do that? Now, there are solutions to this. There are cloud-based mobile labs. Perfecto Mobile is one that we're exploring, and I don't completely understand all the mechanics of it. I've repeatedly asked for a demo, and I keep getting told, yeah, we'll schedule one in the future. But essentially what it boils down to is these various companies have racks of physical devices that you can access through the cloud. Right, now, I'm not entirely certain if that means there's actually people tapping it or if they've got some kind of a layer that allows me to simulate this stuff. And I think that's basically what it boils down to is they have kind of like a browser interface that you can use to write scripts that will then be executed against your device. And frankly, that's what we need to do for most companies to get to that really esoteric level of testing. The way I talk about it internally is we sort of have 3 layers of testing. There's the developer level stuff. And that's what I call the mobile kit in a bag. So a given team, when they fire up a mobile project, day one, a box should show up at the lead developer's desk that has the 8 to 12 devices that we're targeting, that we've decided through our metrics, through our analytics, through the use cases for this device. This is what it has to work on these 8 to 12, whatever that number is. And those devices are going to live with that project till that project is done and buried. Right. That is there for developer level testing and debugging, maybe for sort of that developer QA, or if you've got some QA folks sitting with them. Could also be for some sort of customer acceptance testing kind of things. One level up from that is what I sort of call the mobile lab. And so one of the things that we have internally is what we call the lending library. And so if there's a more esoteric device that falls outside of that 8 to 10, so let's say we get a defect in on one of our projects, like this didn't render right on what's the new Samsung Mega or something. Okay, well, each project doesn't want to have to own or lease a Mega, but the lending library would have one. You fire off a request and the next day or whatever, we ship it out and it shows up at your desk and now you get it for a week or 2 weeks or whatever you need to test on that device. The next layer up from that is the Perfecto Mobile Lab style thing. And this is where we've got our regression testing. This is where we start getting into, well, let's simulate that on this carrier. Let's simulate that with 3G. Let's simulate that with LTE. Let's simulate that with 2 bars instead of 5 bars. The much more esoteric level of testing that, frankly, you need to do in order to really push these things and have good confidence that that's going to work, across devices, across carriers, across countries. It's amazing how quickly that matrix expands in your head. As you start doing the math on this, of what does this look like when, and those situations are far more common than you would ever imagine. So for us, one of the big things that we deal with, I work for an insurance company, so we send claim adjusters in when there's been a disaster. And almost by definition, that means that the cell towers are being just flooded. Because maybe the landlines are down, everybody's trying to get a hold of their relatives, and it's a bit of mass chaos. And your app has to function in that environment. They can't be sitting there going, well, the app only works if I've got 5 bars of LTE. That's unacceptable. It needs to work. So how do we prove that out? Well, that's where we take advantage of the labs in the proverbial cloud. So that's scary. That's a very real thing. There was one app developer who looked at his logs and said he encountered nearly 4,000 unique devices. 4,000. Right? So this was the little matrix he put together. Now, bear in mind that a lot of these, especially in that lower right-hand corner, that's pretty esoteric. Maybe he's got 1 or 2 or 3, and obviously it's this sort of side that we're probably more concerned about from an enterprise level. But the reality is, if enough of these folks over here are really unhappy with you and start leaving 1-star reviews, that hurts. Yes, sir?
How big an impact is globalization? You get issues where you've got a device that's a problem, it's not actually available in your country.
Yeah, what do you do about globalization? That's a great question. You know, I think it's another one of the big issues that certainly happens here in Europe is the fact that you need to account for somebody using your app, and yeah, maybe they're based in the UK, but they go travel to Germany. They go travel to France. They go travel to, you know, pick any country that's not that far away. Does your app still work there? Does it work on those carriers? You know, and I mean, for us, it's certainly an interesting issue because what do we need to do? And I've actually broached this with our sort of mobile competency group. What happens if I get a defect for a device that's no longer sold? What do? We go to eBay, right? You know, and that's kind of a scary thought that there will be devices that, from our standpoint as geeks, like, oh well, that's so 3 years ago. Nobody has that anymore. My in-laws still haven't updated their iPhones, and their iPhones are now 4 generations behind. 4 generations. So how many people fall into that bucket? It's probably a lot. So no, it's definitely an interesting issue. Now, there are companies that will essentially lease you the devices, in which case they, at least in theory, have a stash of old devices. Although, you know, obviously if there's a run on, you know, pick something, you know, Galaxy S1 or whatever it is that's, you know, more esoteric, yeah, you run into some issues there. So, and by the way, one other thing to throw in here is people say, oh, but I've got a simulator. I'll just test it on the simulator on my laptop. Yeah, simulators lie. It's close. It's good most of the time. I guarantee you will run into a situation where something works on the simulator, you get on the physical device, and it doesn't work. You need to have a certain set of physical devices to do mobile development. That's non-negotiable. You know, we can argue around the edges as to what those devices are, and that's going to wholly depend on what you're building, who you're targeting, and your logs are your best friend here to figure out what you need to target. All right, and that will, of course, change. You know, we've already had that conversation internally. You know, how quickly do we adopt like a new Samsung Galaxy phone, a new iPhone, things like that? And frankly, it'll be pretty fast for those levels of devices. You know, for the handset manufacturers that aren't doing quite so well, you know, those we can probably ignore. But certainly for the major players, they release a new device, there's a pretty good chance you're going to need to add that to your kit really fast. So, OpenSignal has done some interesting sort of reporting in this space, and this is their fragmentation diagram. Again, this is a nightmare for us, frankly, to try to develop to these things. Now, again, we're probably mostly worried about this quadrant, but can we ignore this? Maybe, maybe not. It depends. You know, if you're doing something for the government, you can't tell people, I'm sorry, we're not going to help you just because you came in with an old phone. If you're targeting you know, different demographic, you might be able to get away with saying, you know what, we're going to aim over here because our data shows us that most of our customers are coming in with a device that's, you know, N-1 or N-2 or something like that, and that's reasonable. Right? This is, again, where your logs are your friend. Let them help you here. Now, some people refer to this as the matrix of pain. I agree with that. Again, it will make you pine for the old era of just having to fight between a couple different browser versions. You know, and there still really isn't a great sort of shim layer like a jQuery yet. Now, I'd like to claim it's just devices, but it isn't. It's screen sizes. So in the Android world, you're dealing with almost every possible permutation of screen size known to man. Right? So the thicker bars are, in theory, the more popular ones, but man, that's a lot of different resolutions and screen sizes. Now, to put this in perspective, and part of the reason why a lot of developers lean iOS, frankly, here's this corresponding version for iOS. There you go. That's what you have to target. Have fun. Right, so this is another huge pain point. Ironically enough, one of the larger sort of phablet devices has a mode that you can run the UI in, and it shrinks the UI down by about 2/3 or so that it's more one. It's like, I think they call it one hand mode or something like that. Does that sound right? You know, to me that's very funny that a device has a mode you can swipe it in and whoosh, you know, a black bar basically shows on part of your screen. It's like, maybe it's too large if we need to shrink it to make it usable. Not sure. Oh man, carriers. This is another pain point. And certainly it's a troublesome in the States. I think it's even more of a pain in Europe because you have to expect people are going to travel across borders. And then what happens? Does the app still function? Does it still work the way we expect it to? What does the coverage look like? What kind of speeds do we have? It certainly is a more challenging environment than what we faced typically. We need to think about app markets. Honestly, there's really two big giants here. There's iOS, there's Google's Play. And a lot of companies will have their own internal app stores to get apps out to their internal employees. But for a lot of folks, they expect to go to their preferred app store and find your app. And if it's not there, that's problematic. Now, some people got very excited when Amazon dipped their toe in this water because they have their own app market. Boy, before you go down that path, take a look at that blog entry because these guys were featured in the Amazon's App Store and it cost them a lot of money. Right? They very quickly figured out that that's not necessarily a good place to be because Amazon gets to change pricing on you. They get to give away your app if they want to. Well, I think they ask your permission to give away your app, but basically what these guys found is by having their app be given away for free, they gained a whole bunch of customers that increased the cost of their backend infrastructure, and that weren't able to monetize that in any way, so it cost them quite a bit of money. Fragmentation is painful. I'm basically the opinion we can stick a fork in BlackBerry at this point. Clearly they have issues. I don't see them surviving long term. They've dropped precipitously. I know in the U.S. there is at least one carrier that no longer stocks BlackBerry phones. I think they're really trying to target enterprise, and I think they've probably lost that battle. Windows Phone certainly has not taken off in the States. Is it any different in Europe? Is it still pretty secondary, or I should almost say tertiary at this point? It feels that way now. I think they're too late to the buy Nokia thing. That to me feels a bit like a move of desperation. My suspicion is Nokia was very close to building an Android phone if they weren't, I've heard rumors that they had one in the pipeline, and Microsoft may have heard that and said we can't possibly let essentially our one main manufacturer shut down and go Android. Now, the Surface has gotten some attention, and I do find it kind of ironic that they had to reuse a name. Those never went anywhere at all. They were very much a curiosity. I actually knew one guy who bought one of these out of his own pocket because he thought it was going to be the next big thing, so he bought one to learn how to develop for it. It was like 10 grand US. It's like, really, dude? What were you thinking? So no, of course, they decided to rename it. And of course, now really we're talking the Surface 2 because the Surface 1 didn't go over so great. Microsoft took a $900 million write-off, I think, on the RT or something like that. So they clearly didn't sell the numbers that they had anticipated. So that factors into this equation as well. This device size thing, though, is also something you need to be very, very aware of. It is a deeply moving target. And at this point, we're basically targeting everything from 3.5 inches all the way up to 10, 13 inches, somewhere in that ballpark. And unfortunately, because people really like to hate on developers, the viewports they're not always the size you expect them to be, for the given device, because that would just be way too easy. So this variety that we face today, I argue that we're in an era of a level of client-side volatility that we've never seen before. This is just unprecedented, and I think it's going to have some really serious ramifications for us. But Luke Robleski put this out, and it's already changed from when he created this, but you look at what we have to target from 3.5 to 4 to 4.3, 5, 7, 5.5, 7. Now there's that 6.3 thing in between here, all different size tablets. Now you're starting to get into this weird scenario where some laptops are kind of hybrid-y devices. The Surface kind of fits in this mix as well a little bit. Here's the thing, guys. I don't know what we're going to have to target in a year or two. I may have some educated guesses, but that's all they are, is guesses. The one thing I know for certain, it will be different. It will be different than what we're doing today. So the model that we're pushing towards is essentially walling that client off from the back-end services. The back-end services are where we're going to get reuse. This is a fundamental shift for a lot of folks. You think about the way we've built apps seemingly since the beginning of time. The reuse, you'd build an app, and you're going to be able to use that app for 10, 15, 20 years. And the app was the UI all the way back to the database and interactions. Nowadays, we need to have a separation where here's the clients, plural, here's the web services. We're going to get 10, 15 years of reuse out of the web services, hopefully. But the clients, you may build a client and basically delete it a year and a half later, 2 years later. You may have to have multiple clients that are talking to the same web service. And I know that's kind of a scary thought. Oh my God, different code bases. But if the client is responsible for rendering and the backend is responsible for the business logic, this should be a fairly lightweight part of our stack. And having multiple UI code bases shouldn't be as bad as having literally multiple copies of apps. That's not what we're talking about anymore. Now, one of the advantages of this is many companies have spent a lot of time recently building services. So we are in a position to take advantage of that. It's on us to tell that story. In fact, some of my coworkers and I, we've had that conversation, and that was kind of a light bulb moment where it's like, hey, wait, you're right. We do have a bunch of web services. We need to tell our customers we're not that far from being able to solve this problem. And we can argue around the edges of the implementation details of that client. But again, the volatility we're seeing in this client space is like nothing we've ever seen before. And the only thing I know for certain is the device we need to target in a year or two will be different than the one we're worried about today. So you can't test them all. There just isn't a heat death of the universe will happen first. You're going to have to pick a representative sample and do the best you can, understanding that some things are going to slip through. You're going to get some defects on something you didn't think about. You're going to have to add that into your matrix. But if you try to test everything day one, frankly, it's paralyzing. And you're just like, oh my God, that's like 9,000 different devices and combinations. So look for the representative stuff, test that, and see where that gets you, knowing that you will agilely adapt. Now, one of the things that's interesting is you have seen some mobile apps have come out that are exclusive to handsets. They say this only works on this handset or greater. Now, maybe you can get away with that. Maybe you can't. Again, it depends on your customers, who you're targeting, what they're looking to do. So again, that puts us into this really interesting conundrum. Should we build a native app? I mean, man, a lot of testing, a lot of pain that goes along with that. It certainly is expensive. It can be, at least, if you want one that isn't really horrible. It is not something that springs forth from someone's head fully formed. This is going to take some time. Now, unfortunately, the skill sets here are not complementary, at least from a day in, day out coding standpoint. I mean, let's be honest, coding is coding. And I'm of the opinion that every developer in this room can easily write Objective-C or Dalvik or whatever. I don't think that's really that much of a problem. Frankly, I think UI design is a bigger challenge than the actual technical underpinnings. Now, you're not going to be maybe a competent Objective-C or Dalvik developer for a period of time, and it can be very useful and very cost-effective to have someone on staff that has deep experience here to help everybody kind of get up to speed and understand the tricks and the ins and the outs. But it does paint us into an interesting corner. And we can use HTML5 here. This is one of these sort of escape hatches, as it were, although I've seen at least a few folks claim that HTML5 is sort of a head fake, that it really isn't as useful here as maybe we'd all like it to be. But the reality is, mobile browsers have outstanding support. I mean, we proved that on Tuesday, didn't we? I mean, that to me is pretty amazing. In fact, now this doesn't apply to you, but for a lot of people, the browser in their pocket or their purse is more modern than the one on their desktop. It does not apply to you. Right? Some of you are probably running nightly builds of your favorite browser. But for the vast majority of folks, they only upgrade their browser when they get a new machine, when the browser itself updates itself, or you go over to their house and install a new one. That's pretty much the only way most normal people update their browsers. Now, there have been some folks who have claimed that this is a repeat of Microsoft versus Apple, with Apple playing the role of Apple and now Google playing the role of Microsoft. I don't believe that's true. I think we have a very interesting and different game today than we had in the PC market. Of course, snarkily, you can ask an interesting question. This didn't turn out so badly for Apple. They have quite a bit of cash in the bank, and they make quite a bit of cash every single quarter. They're very, very profitable. So if that's what losing looks like, I'd sign up for that any day of the week. But it isn't a zero-sum game, and frankly, I don't even think it's the same game. Again, guys, 2011 alone, Apple sold more iOS devices than they sold Macs in 28 years. That is crazy. The handset market is immense. Immense. I mean, even selling 400, 500 million devices isn't going to get you a dominant position in this market, but it's a pretty darn nice one to have. So we're seeing billions of dollars in this space. Now, for us, that's great because there's some really interesting opportunities here, and we can sort of skirt around the edge of device issues by dealing with a web app, a hybrid app, using HTML5, et cetera. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, man, I don't want to go near this native thing. That sounds like a pain. I'm just going to build a web app, right? That's the answer to this problem. There's 3 answers that always work in computer science. Every question you've ever been asked. You can always say 42. That's the geek check. If you're not sure why that's funny, look around, the people are smiling. Another layer of indirection. And of course, my all-time personal favorite, which is it depends. Now, I had a friend of mine, I threw this out on Twitter for something or another, and he got after me, and he's like, Nate, that's a bad answer, it's a cop-out. Absolutely. And by the way, the next question you should ask when someone says this to you is, on what? Right? So it does absolutely matter. One of the things you need to look at here is usability. There is an argument to be made that a native app has better usability than a web app or a hybrid app. Although it is very arguable that that's starting to shift, and that as we sort of get more of a design vocabulary around sort of mobile web and the web in general, that people are starting to bridge some of that gap a little bit. There are a little bit of performance considerations, though, potentially. There is an argument to be made that users favor native apps, or at least hybrid apps, as opposed to websites. Right? So depending on who you look at, some people would say even as high as 85% would rather have an app than a website. It's hard to argue there. I do think it's very clear that apps are today the way the world works. People expect apps to a certain extent. There are hundreds and thousands of them out there. Being found in that market is very difficult, that's for sure. Now, some people will argue to you that a mobile website is easier to build because we've been building websites for 20 years. It isn't necessarily a straight line to do that, so be cautious with that. Massive trade-offs here. All right, so just because we've built web apps for a while doesn't mean we can translate that automatically to the mobile device. The mobile device is very different from what we've traditionally targeted. We're losing somewhere in the neighborhood of 3/4 of our real estate, at least if we're talking about a phone. Tablets, it's a little closer, but still, these things aren't mouse pointers. Not even close. So I'm very much of the opinion the most important thing here isn't whether we build a native app or a web app or a hybrid app. It's that we've rethought the experience and that what we're delivering actually makes sense to our customers in a mobile context. Now, it's really easy if the thing you want to do isn't done in the browser. If the browser doesn't access something you need to access, okay, we're not building a web app. That may push you towards at least a hybrid app, and maybe even all the way over to a full-on native app. Understand that even with the hybrid option, in many, many cases, the web view that you get there from the operating system is not going to perform as well as the browser the operating system has. And in some cases, the default browser, at least on Android, has not been as good as secondary browsers you could install. Right? So for a while, browser on Android was significantly slower than Chrome on Android, which is kind of mind-boggling. It's like, why wouldn't Chrome be the default browser on Android? Right? So I'm not sure. Has that finally switched over? Is Chrome the default browser in like 4.3? Still not? Oh, that's sad. Right? So on iOS in particular, Safari has certain privileges that essentially UI WebKit view doesn't have. So there's certain optimizations that have been added into Safari to sort of JIT the code and do some just-in-time compilation that isn't accessible to the WebKit views. So you will potentially see some performance differences. That's something to keep in mind as well. Right, so certain features just aren't surfaced in the browser. Device APIs may eventually let us tie into some of those on some devices, but that way lies some pain. Now, I would argue that some of these things are probably never going to be fully exposed in the browser, or at least I'm not so sure that I want them to. They're really, to me, multi-touch and notifications. I can't think of a good reason why the browser shouldn't have that. I'm not so sure I want the browser to be able to directly access my camera, the audio componentry, or my contact book. But that's just me. When you think about what that provides in terms of malware vector, and that gives me the willies. Now, this list will change. There's no getting around that. And again, there are these sort of HTML5 device APIs that, at least in theory, can bridge some of these gaps. Your mileage will certainly vary here. It can be harder to monetize a web apps asset. So this is one of those things you have to consider. If you are like I'm blanking on the name of the company that makes Basecamp and things like this, 37 Signals. If you're a company that already has existing customers that have a subscription to you, like Salesforce or something like that, they're already used to using the browser. The mobile browser makes a lot of sense. It's just an add-on to that, same login infrastructure, et cetera. If I'm trying to build something new and now charge for it, getting someone to pay for a web app, good luck. You might be able to get a subscription. You know, that seems to be somewhat plausible. But here's the real challenge. Apple, Amazon, Google, they have a whole boatload of credit card numbers on file. I have personally purchased a large number of things through Apple and Amazon that I would not likely have purchased from the random developer that created them, because it's like, you know, Bob's software. It's like, I'm not going to give Bob my credit card number, but Amazon or Apple, they're the ones that are actually holding that. And so I trust them. I trust that they have the right security infrastructure in place to protect my private data. Right? So who are you most likely going to give your credit card number to? Bob's random software shop, or Amazon, or Google, or Apple? So there's a lot of developers who are upset that the gatekeepers, as it were, are taking a chunk of the change here, but I think it's warranted given what they give you in return. The fact that they've made it ridiculously easy for people to give you money. Right? It is almost frictionless for someone to give you money, especially now with the thumbprint reader that's built into the iPhone 5S. Someone can purchase from you with just putting their thumb on the frickin' button. That's huge. Now, finding stuff's hard no matter what we're talking about here. We're talking hundreds of thousands of apps in the App Store. We're talking billions and billions of websites in the big bad world. I would argue it's actually much harder to be found on the web. Although in the app stores, the sort of top 50, top 100 kind of list, some of the curation, that can help. Some people would argue that's actually fairly skewed, and that a lot of things end up falling off of those lists so quickly that you really can't make a whole lot off that. So I would like to see the various app stores give us some little better curation around that, but we'll see what happens. Now again, if you've already got an established franchise, if you're an existing company like 37 Signals, this becomes a little easier. People already know who you are, people are already giving you money. Makes it a lot simpler to say, oh, and just go to our mobile website to see what that looks like. Now bear in mind, depending on the market, some people may expect when they go to their respective app store that they're going to find you. And if they don't, they're going to be like, oh, well, maybe I should move to their competitor because their competitor has an app here. So you do honestly need to look at your market. What are you targeting? Is this internal customers? In which case, guess what? You get to dictate, or you can dictate potentially, unless this is a BYOD kind of situation. If this is the big bad world, we've lost that war. There is no chance that you're going to be able to tell somebody, please return to my site with a new phone. Good luck. That's a customer who's going to write a really nasty review on you. Now again, I think the most important part of this is not so much how we deliver it, as getting our heads wrapped around what does someone need to do with their mobile experience. We need to get it down to the essence, and this is hard. This is a challenge because you got to have that conversation very early on in the process. You don't get to have everything. What are the top 3 things? So once you think you have that essence, cut some more. Again, it all goes back to this. If we get this intersection wrong, we fail. Right? We must get that intersection right. We need to expect that usage is going to be a little choppier than normal. It's going to be a little sprintier. It's not going to be such a marathon, although that depends. I was at a dermatologist's office last year, and they used an iPad for all the healthcare-related stuff. The whole exam was done with the nurse was taking notes on an iPad. All right, one-handed use. Remember these things, not mouse pointers. All right, so got to be usable with one thumb. It's not a game. You don't want targets to be guesses. They should be very obvious. And of course, it's entirely possible that you may actually have both. Amazon has everything. They have mobile websites, mobile native apps, iPad optimized sites, iPad apps, you name it, they have it. Now, you may not have the luxury of their resources, but it is something to consider. This doesn't necessarily have to be, well, we've made this choice and that's it. That's the only thing we can do. There may be some value in trying 2 or 3 different things and sort of seeing what sticks in the market. All right. So before I let you go, I want to talk about one more thing. And that's this notion of shell apps. And so I've kind of mentioned this a little bit. Hybrid apps, another way of thinking about this, is basically a web view with web content, but you wrap it in some way, shape, or form so you can take advantage of the native APIs. You know, this is PhoneGap, SensuTouch, Appcelerator, Titanium, things of that nature. Now, a lot of folks have said this is awesome because it gives you the best of both worlds. Other people very quickly say, no, no, it gives you the worst of both worlds. Hybrid apps, to me, you got to go there with caution. And I know it's a very seductive thing for a lot of us because it seems like such a good idea. There are pluses, don't get me wrong. In theory, this is I write once, it runs everywhere. And because it's web content, I can release updates without necessarily having to shove the whole thing back through the App Store, since most of it tends to be what's in the browser window itself. It does allow us to use that familiar sort of web stack that we're used to, although again, it's very different to design for something that's 3, 4.5, as it is to a typical monitor that we've designed for in the past. Now, there are some downsides. If you programmed Java back in the day, you know that Swing never really took off. And Swing was supposed to be the cross-platform UI framework to rule them all. Yeah, not so much. The scarier thing for me, though, is now I'm reliant on somebody else's schedule. So let's say you decide that PhoneGap or something like that's the answer. That's awesome. New version of iOS 7 comes out. 200 million people have updated in the first 3 days. iOS 7 has the API that is going to make your app just sing and dance, and it's going to be great. Oh, but they haven't updated their framework yet, so I can't take advantage of those APIs yet. And my competitor who built the native app, they've already released a new update that looks iOS 7 native, and it's got all those APIs, and I look dated, and I have to wait until these guys get around to making the update. Performance can very much be an issue here. It's very common to see these not perform as well as a native app. The bigger issue is what I call the uncanny valley of UI design. Now, the uncanny valley comes from robotics, right? And other people would call this, the shell apps and silver bullets, but man, the uncanny valley is scary because it puts you in a situation where it looks sort of native but not, and it gets kind of creepy. But what a lot of folks who've actually done this have said is, man, when I tried building that shell app, it looked really easy at first, but then it started to get really complicated, and it just blew us out of the water, right? So Rich Hickey made a great, great talk on this. He said, simple made easy. And what he says is we don't want to look for the easy answer. We want to look for the simple answer. And in many cases, that might be the counterintuitive one, right? But the moral of the story is, guys, there are no silver bullets here. There's no vendor that has this solved, nor will they ever have it solved. There's no easy, clear-cut answer. It really boils down to kind of a decision matrix that you need to ask yourself about your app, your target audience, who's going to use it. So native versus HTML5. Well, there's pros and there's cons. Some people have talked about, this is really the wrong argument. They're all web apps because this is all being, delivered over HTTP. A lot of apps, frankly, could be HTML5. They wouldn't have to be native. But the more interesting question is, should they be? And again, a lot of this boils down to, what do your users need? What's going to give them the best experience? Now, some people have said publishers, they don't like apps. Some of the publishers out there, they've gone away from physical apps, although maybe they're just not doing it right. It's entirely possible that what they have is the wrong model. Trying to ship down a 500 meg magazine that's literally just a PDF of what they print online is probably not quite the right answer there. But I want to come back to this uncanny valley thing. Right, so uncanny valley, again, comes out of robotics. And basically what it says is when you make a robot look like a robot, it's not creepy. Robot, not creepy. Idealized robot, not creepy. You want to see what the uncanny valley is, it's this right here. That's a robot. It's creepy. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the hair, the eyes, the lack of a soul, but that's wrong. And this is what happens when we get something that's 94% right. This happens to our interfaces too. When you have an interface that looks mostly native but not quite, it looks creepy. and you will never ever get a defect that says you've crossed the uncanny valley, that's why I deleted your app. They just will delete your app. Right? If you're going to build for a platform, make it look like what that platform is. Try to follow their standards. Don't try to make an iOS app on Android or an Android app on iOS. That's going to bother those customers. You know, and I'm very much of the opinion that if we're going to build a web app, it's okay to build a web app. It doesn't have to be native or look native, right? So stop trying to do that. Now, here's the reality for us, guys. It's a brave new world. And I would argue this is an incredibly exciting time for us. We get to do an awful lot of cool stuff. There's a lot of really hard decisions out there. I wish it wasn't so hard. But the reality is we don't have much of a choice here. We can't stick our head in the sand and hope this problem goes away. It won't. So the single most important thing here, guys, is asking yourself, what does our mobile experience need to provide? What do our customers need? And go from there. Whew. Questions, comments, theories, queries? All right, well, there should be some sugar and caffeine, several stories above us. Let's go recharge here for one more session. Thanks for coming and spending some time. I really appreciate it.